How Christians Can Preserve God's Gift of Freedom Through Political Activity. Now, Keith, as you joining us, I just have to say, that sounds controversial and not politically correct. What in the world are you talking about?
Well, to me, you can't write about politics today and not be controversial. I mean, no matter what you say, there are going to be one segment of our population is going to consider that controversial. So I'm sure, though, that some people would consider that controversial.
You know, Keith, you say that Christians ought to be involved in politics, but there's a growing segment of evangelicals who say we've already lost the culture war and we just ought to stick to our knitting, stay in our churches, preach the gospel, and let the pagans do whatever they're going to do out in the political realm, and we should just walk away from it. What do you say to that?
Well, if you look at what's going on in society, you could be very pessimistic, I'd say, but on the other hand, we're supposed to be faithful to what God wants us to do. You know, if we should be involved in politics, then we should, and, the results, of course, are going to be up to God, what happens, but we shouldn't shrink back, I don't think, just simply because things look kind of bad in our country.
Do you know what I'm thinking about? I'm thinking about the election. And over again, I can't tell you how many Christians that I spoke with that said, I'm just not voting because I don't want to vote for Mitt Romney because he's a Mormon, and I don't want to vote for Obama because we don't know what he believes. So they just checked out. And see, I don't feel like that's God's will for us. I mean, is that kind of where you're coming from?
No, I don't think that's God's will at all. And, of course, we didn't have real good options in this last election. I would agree with that. But part of the reason we didn't have good options is because maybe because there weren't enough Christians involved in politics, because all the other steps leading up to who ends up being the nominee is influenced by people being involved in politics. So, hopefully the next time we'll have better options. But it's not only about the president either. I think there's too much emphasis put on the presidential election. If we'd put as much emphasis, on the Congress as we did on that, I think we probably would have a better result in this country, actually.
Well, Keith, doesn't it even come closer to home than that? We need to be involved in our school boards because that controls what they're going to teach our children for those that use public school. We need to be involved in our city councils because they're going to adopt things. And every year at this time, we begin to think of Christmas and Thanksgiving. But when you think about some of the nativity sets that for years have been put on city property, now they can't be anymore. The city council and some of those things are as important to us locally as our national congressmen and senators are, aren't they?
That's true. And here in Minnesota, the elections for school board and for city usually are in the off year, and the turnouts are pathetically bad. And like with the school boards, what happens is the educational establishment that's pushing all this humanism and everything in schools, they know who their candidates are. They get their people out, and the other people stay home, basically.
Keith, you actually ran for office a couple times, state legislature and for the Congress. Tell us what you learned in a practical way from both of those experiences.
Well, it was kind of frustrating to me because I'm a very philosophical type person, and I really like to lay out the issues the way they are. And it seemed like in an election, you have to be so careful not to offend anybody, and you have to couch the way you address issues in such a way that no one, that no one's going to be offended. And you try to appeal to everybody. So it was a frustrating experience for me. I learned that, I guess, more than anything. And I probably learned that maybe isn't the right role for me. Maybe writing a book is a better thing for me to be doing than running for office.
This is author Keith W. Johnson, Endowed by Our Creator, How Christians Can Preserve God's Gift of Freedom Through Political Activity. Now, Keith, you said something. You said sometimes it is appropriate for Christians to disobey government. When is that? When does that take place?
Well, it's interesting because we've had a study at church here just ended the last night for several weeks and talking about Christian in America. And we had a lot of discussion about that. We had some differences of opinion. I guess, every person is going to draw the line probably a little bit differently, but certainly I think the easy one is if the government says you can't preach the gospel. I mean, that happened in Acts, and Peter said we have to obey God rather than men, and so that's an easy one. But one of the questions that came up was, what if the government asked you to turn your gun in? Would you turn it in? Well, To me, when they do that, they're on on the verge of something like what happened in Nazi Germany. So I'm not sure what I would do in that case. I mean, but some people thought that you should do it to be submissive to government, and other people felt they couldn't do that. So there's some really tough questions, but we may be faced with some of those questions fairly soon, I think, because government is growing in its power. They're taking over more and more functions and everything. So I think we're really going to be faced with that question as Christians. I think we have to pray about it and really seek God's will for that, and see what we should do personally.
Keith, you've got a chapter in your book about Christians on the political spectrum, which you point out that if you look at the broad spectrum, you've got Christians. Those who care to get involved or take a stand, I mean, you've got them all along the political spectrum, not just in one place. How as Christians do we get along when we have some fun, just with each other? I'm not even talking about people outside the church. How do you get along with people with whom you may worship together, but you don't see politically everything eye to eye in terms of legislation?
Well, I mean, the thing is, we have to separate out, I think, the political views from our view of them as a person. I mean, I know people that I like a lot, that I consider friends, and that I disagree with them almost 100%. I mean, right now on Facebook, I'm in an exchange. I've gotten in an exchange with one of my classmates from high school, and she is just, on the other opposite part of the spectrum from me, but nevertheless, I like her, and we get along and everything. So we have to try to separate that out, particularly as Christians, but I know that sometimes people's views on politics are very strongly held, and they feel very intense about them. And unfortunately, I think sometimes we feel more strongly about that than we do about some Christian issues, which is unfortunate. I mean, there is a matter of balance here.
This is the program, Today's Issues, on American Family Radio. Jim Stanley alongside Lauren Stewart, and also our friend Ray Pritchard joining us from Dallas. We're talking with Keith Johnson, and Keith is the author of the book called Endowed by Our Creator. Keith, tell us where we can find the book and how we can find more information about your teachings.
Okay, well, the book is available through the publisher, which is Life Sentence Publishing, and their website is www.lifesentencepublishing.com. It's available at Barnes & Noble online, and it would be available also through Christian bookstores or Barnes & Noble stores, or really any stores that sell books.
And for those that use Kindles and things of that nature, you also have it available as an ebook?
Yes.
Okay. Our guest again is Keith W. Johnson, talking about Endowed by Our Creator, how Christians can preserve God's gift of freedom through political activity. In the book, one of the things you talk about is a case where the Constitution's meaning has been violated. How do you make that judgment?
Well, I think there may be some cases where it's tough, but I think a lot of them aren't that tough. I mean, the Constitution does not mention education at all. Education was not a function of the national government at the time the Constitution was adopted. And the 10th Amendment says basically all those things which are not rights or functions which are not specifically delegated to the federal government remain with the states and with the people. So to me, that's an easy one. The federal government should have really no role in education whatsoever. And yes, there are going to be some situations where it's tougher to answer that question. But I think that a lot of them are pretty cut and dried, and the courts have just basically ignored those parts of the Constitution that they don't agree with, and they let their personal opinions prevail over what the obvious written intent was of those who wrote the Constitution.
Yeah, now don't misunderstand me. I don't disagree with you. I think many portions of the Constitution have been violated and even renamed, even to the point where right now you see someone who's in the executive office overriding the legislative branch. After a law has been passed and signed, our president comes back and decrees that part of that doesn't have to be enforced now. And the Constitution doesn't invest him with that right, does it?
It does not. And, of course, the the presidents over time have been taking on more and more functions, grabbing more power. But I partly fault the Congress for that because they haven't stood up and said no. They haven't taken action to prevent that and cut his wings, so to speak. And then over time, then the next president will take on a few more things, and it just grows and grows. And the president, I guess the way I see it, the president would have been a lot less important, should be a lot less important than the Congress, because they're the ones that make the laws. But over time, the president has taken on more.
Keith,
more
you've got a chapter in your book called "Are There Conspiracies?" That's a leading question, if there ever was one.
Wait a minute. Hold on. The black helicopters are circling.
Well, okay. First, I want to say that I am not going out there talking about any particular conspiracy there. I'm just addressing the whole idea whether there are conspiracies behind what's going on today, and that's what I'm doing. And I'm not. It takes obviously more than one chapter to detail and go into any kind of conspiracies. But part of it, I think, depends on what your definition of a conspiracy is. I think that today a lot of people have heard about the Council on Foreign Relations, the Trilateral Commission. These people wield an awful lot of power behind the scenes to promote, and they're frank about it, to promote a one world government, new world order, as they would call it. Now, is that a conspiracy? I mean, the Council on Foreign Relations publishes a quarterly called Foreign Affairs, so people can read in there. But I would say, in a sense, they are, because David Rockefeller in his biography pretty much admitted that. They say people accuse me of doing this and wanting a new world and all this type of thing. He says he was in fact proud of it. He said so. I think in a way they're counting on the fact that the average person doesn't read Foreign Affairs or doesn't go on their websites or explore or investigate their views and what they're doing. So. But one of the things, so many people, I've heard that Christians say this, well, I don't think there's any conspiracy because, Satan's behind all this. And to me, that's not an either-or situation. Certainly, Satan would want to promote things that were against Christianity, a world order that's secular and humanistic. But why wouldn't he also work to organize conspiracies of people to work for that, too? So to me, that's not an either-or. So that's not actually a good reason for saying there's no conspiracies, because it's all Satan.
How can you encourage someone listening that says, why is it important for me to be politically active in turn to carry out the Great Commission? How did those two collide, and why are they important? Because I do think a lot of times we feel like if it doesn't have something to do with us in our family, we don't need to be knowledgeable about it. But that's not true, because when things are going on politically, it is going to trickle down and affect our families. And that's what we've got to get into our heads, is to be involved. But how do you equate that with following out the Great Commission?
Okay, well, I devote 2 chapters of the book, the first 2 chapters actually, to the issue of whether we should be involved in politics, and I definitely, clearly believe that we should. And the thing is that the title of the book is Endowed by Our Creator. Of course, that's taken from the Declaration of Independence, and where it says that we're endowed with our Creator with certain inalienable rights, and among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. So when God gives us rights, I think that implies that we should take effort to preserve those rights. I mean, if you're given a valuable gift, I think you have a responsibility to do that, to take care of it. And if the gift comes from God, who is the God and creator of the whole universe, I mean, to me it's important to preserve that right. And if you look around the world and in history, you'll find that there are not very many people who are really fully able to use the freedom and rights that God has given them because of their governments. And in some cases, in very restrictive governments, they can't use much of it at all. I'm thinking of some of the Islamic states and communist countries and that type of thing. So to me, just the fact that our freedom is a gift from God in and of itself, just for consideration, out of consideration to Him, we have a responsibility to preserve that. And that takes some effort. It's like somebody could give you a very expensive car, and it's filled with gas, and it's a new car, so it works. You can turn the key and start using it. Well, freedom's a little bit different. Freedom usually doesn't exist to any great degree unless there's some specific effort made to preserve it and maintain it. And, of course, in the case of the United States, where we've enjoyed a lot of freedom, is because of the actions of our founding fathers. They set up a constitution which called for a very limited government, with the government, not doing much at all, which meant that the people were very, very free. We were able to use the freedoms that God has given us. However, of course, just setting a system like that up isn't enough. You have to work to preserve it. I mean, that's a cliche, but it's very true that eternal vigilance is the price of freedom. So that in itself is probably the biggest reason why Christians should be involved in politics. Now, as far as the Great Commission, that is the most important instruction, command, really, that Christ gave us.